This video is going to be all about how to build the kinetic train coaster that's part of our November 2018 box of making. And we'll start, as all of our videos do, with taking a look at the pieces and parts and getting you set up to decorate them. This one I think you're going to have lots of fun with decorating. You can use metallics. You can use paints on the top level. We'll talk about that in a minute as we look at the pieces. But if we open the box, you'll start with your set of screws. Make sure you put those together and on the side so they're available to you and ready to use when you're ready to put your pieces together. Okay, now that you've opened your coaster and you've gotten rid of the screws, let's take a look at the pieces and parts and talk about how you're going to want to decorate them. This piece, it's really important to sand, and I'll tell you which ones you want to do that with as we go along. But you want to make sure that all of this coaster is as smooth as it can be. The smoother it is, the smoother your coaster will spin and the top set of gears will spin. So you just want to be a little bit careful with it as you assemble it. So here's the pieces we're going to talk about. Our bottom, as usual, has Steamy Tech on it and the feet for that. And then we have a piece with a smaller hole that doesn't have any words on it. That will go on top. You're going to see, people are going to pick this up and turn it upside down. They always do. The bottom as well as the inside of this layer. Then we're going to put an annulus on top of this. So your gears are going to spin around against this wood in the inner layer. You're going to make sure you sand that very carefully. The annulus will go here. And then we're going to take one of our thick ring pieces, and we're going to end up gluing that to the top of this annulus. That means there's not going to be too much spinning on the annulus itself, but there will be friction. This is where the piece is going to roll, is right here. So make sure you get this thick ring sanded well. Once it's built, you're never ever going to see any of that thick ring at all. Now, let's go take a look at our train piece itself. That's going to go next. As you'll notice, you can see the train, but there are also gears that are across the top of here and across the top down here. So you're going to want to make sure very carefully that you sand the top of the train, get rid of all the dust out of it. And then I wouldn't recommend using paint on it because paint won't give you a smooth surface and it will rub off with the gears that move on it. But a silver Sharpie or one of the silver paint markers, the silver markers out of your box from this time will look great across the top of your train as well. And then we've got a set of things that are going to go on top. So you're not going to see the outside rim of this because we're going to glue 1 and 2 thick rings to the top of that. And then we're going to put a thin ring on top of that. The last piece you'll see when you assemble it then is this one thick top ring. So you can see a little tiny bit of this ring. You're going to make sure that you make it at least dark if you're not decorating it. And you'll very much see the top ring against the train. Now we've also got some additional pieces here to play with. Our gear bag. You're going to have to open it because you're going to want to decorate the gears, but be really, really careful that you don't lose anything. There are 14 pieces of wood in this box to be aware of. So here are my gears, and here's how those are going to go together and how you're going to count those and set them up when you assemble them. These two pieces are going to go under the train right in the middle. There's no way you're ever going to see them, although you may want to sand the top and bottom surfaces before you put it together to make sure it all stays nice and smooth. And then these two are the big gears that are going to go on the bottom to run against the annulus. So you definitely want to make sure that the bottom surface of those is very smooth, and we're going to glue those together into a stack. Then we have our gears that go on our smokestack. And the challenge here is we're looking for the bigger gears. There's one solid gear, but we're looking for the bigger gears that are all solid. So you'll notice that 2 of them match in size and shape perfectly. You can even count the teeth if you want to make sure of that. And then you have one that's a little smaller than that and one that's a little smaller than that. So 3 of those gears are the gears that are going to go across the top of our train like so to be smoke. And you can decorate your smoke however you want it to be. This one is going to get hidden underneath. You will see a little bit of the edges of the teeth, so you may want to make it dark or some specific color because you're going to see a little bit of it, and then that's going to get stacked on top of one of your big gears like this. Then we've also got 5 gears to go on top of the train. The big one goes there. 3 of the little ones will build the center part of the train, and then 1 more small gear will go on the front of the train itself. This little gear with the little etched mark on it goes underneath one of these gears, just like the one that attaches the smoke together, and we'll talk more about how that set works when we're ready to do the assembly. So those are the pieces you're going to see. Again, make sure you sand this well. Make sure you don't get paint on the top surface of any gear or in the teeth of any gear especially, that you want to have spin smoothly. And do all of your preparation and get that put together. This is your acrylic piece. If you've seen one of these before, it's got a little bit of paper on it. We're going to put it on the side and we don't need it until we're ready to do your assembly. So decorate, have fun, and then come back and watch the rest of the video. All right, now that you've got your pieces all decorated, we're ready to start with assembly. So let's start with looking at the pieces and parts in your screw bag. You can grab your screw bag and open it up, and we'll talk about and count the screws that are in it. As always, if you're missing something, you can go grab it from the spare screw kit, or you can reach out to us if you have any questions. So in your screw bag, you're going to have 2 of these little round donuts. We call them spacers. You're going to have a set of feet. Those can go on the side for the moment. You should have 9 little nuts. You should have 1 long screw, that's 5/8 of an inch, and 2 little medium screws that are 1/2, and 6 additional screws that are your 3/8 inch screws that you're going to use in this box. And we're actually going to start this, rather than with glue, by putting the pieces together and making sure that everything is working correctly. So let's start with grabbing the train base and talking about where the gears are going to go on it. And the hardest part, as I mentioned earlier, is getting the right gears from this little set of 4 that look very similar in size. So I'm going to start with the smallest gear. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 teeth on it. And it's going to go over here on the right-hand side. Now, these holes are small enough, you probably will need to screw them in, which is good. That makes it really easy to test and play with before we put the nuts on the back. So I'm going to tighten that one in. Make sure it's loose. Back it up enough to make sure you've got a little playroom and that gear will spin nice and smoothly. Then I'm going to take the next size up and probably check it one more time to make sure it's not the same size as the one that's underneath it. And I'm going to put it here. Notice that you got a little bit of wiggle room between the 2. That's great. Nice and loose. And we'll screw this one down and make sure those 2 gears spin themselves nicely. And finally, we're ready to put this 3rd big gear in. The problem is, I don't have a way to screw that in. So this is where the little donut pieces, we call them spacers, is going to come in really handy. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take one of my 1/2 inch screws, and I'm going to put a little bit of glue around the base of the screw head and make sure that I've got some on the wood. And I'm going to stick this in here like this. Looks like I need to pause for a minute and find a paper towel. You're going to want to make sure, I've got a little piece of paper here I can use. And we're going to get rid of any extra glue that squeezes out. We definitely don't want extra glue on this. Push this down and let it dry a minute. And while that's drying, we'll start on the other side. So the other side gets the big gear on the bottom, like so. That's perfect. Then it gets one of these 3 gears that's all the same size. I'm going to take this one next and put it in. Set it down to make sure everything is nice and loose and going together properly. And finally, make sure those 2 are spinning. Finally put on the 3rd one here in this set of 3 to get this side of the world spinning properly. Check it and make sure we're good. Nice and loose, don't put anything in too tight. And then we're going to use this little tiny gear, and we're going to put the little tiny gear on the back spot. Like so. Make sure that's spinning nicely. And now we're going to do that same thing we just did, but with this gear. So I'm going to flip it over, and this time I'm going to put the glue on it before I put the screw on. Not too much. I'm going to put my little screw through it, and I'm going to put my other thick spacer on it. Let that sit. Make sure that's good and stuck together. Meantime, I think this has dried fairly nicely, and I can now test it. If you drop that in the hole, I should have a nice spinning, smooth spinning piece, which is exactly what we're going to look for. And we're going to be driving it from this tooth on the left-hand side so we can test it from that end. And now I can flip this over, and you'll notice that I've got a little bit more thickness. So that's sticking out because these spacers that we put in are just a little bit thicker than the wood. So now the trick I've been using to do this, the gear we're going to put on the back is this other clear one. So I'm going to do it like that, but the trick I've been using is going ahead and putting glue on the screw and on the piece of wood itself. Just being careful of the threads at the very top. Make sure that's going to be upright when you flip it upside down, because we're going to put it together like this, and before you glue it, you need to slide it through the piece of wood, and then you need to put that down on top of it. And then I'm going to go ahead and put some glue on the threads here, and put this nut on top of that to make sure that this gets nice and tight and fastened together. Usually when we're putting screws on these, we want them to be nice and loose, but in this case, we actually want it to be nice and tight so that it holds that whole stack of 3 pieces of wood together. So we've done that on the top, on the smokestack side. Now we're going to do that same thing on the bottom. We're going to put some glue here. I'm going to take a little bit of that off. I might have got a little bit too much on. I really don't want it to sneak out. I'm going to slide that down through this hole. That should all mesh nicely. Flip it over. I'm going to use my gear that has that little etched piece on it. And I'm going to stick that on top there. And again, I'm now ready to put my nut on top of that and make sure that all stays nice and tightly glued together, so that that bottom gear will stop spinning, and that when we spin it, the whole set spins together. Now, one of the reasons I'm testing this like this is that occasionally you'll get glue underneath this gear and that will sploosh out and get stuck. So if you spin them pretty regularly for a bit, you can make sure that that glue doesn't get stuck and your whole gear train doesn't get stuck. Because the last thing you want is for your gears to get glued down and the train not to spin. We've definitely got to make our gears spin on our train. Once you've got that going and you're really happy with how things are spinning and you're sure your glue has dried properly, then you can flip it over and we can put the nuts on the rest of the backside gears. So I'm just going to put a little dot of glue on the side of these screws. And I'm going to screw the nuts on. Again, we want to make sure this is all nice and loose, so give yourself a paper thickness at least above the screws, above the wood when you screw these together, so that you don't get sponge in your pieces. The other thing you're going to want to be careful of here is if you turn it over and you put too much glue on it, you will end up with little bits of glue getting stuck down in the hole and gluing your pieces together as well. So be really careful that you're not going to do that. So just a little drop of glue on the threads. Told you I was going to drop one of these sooner or later. Make sure you don't tighten anything down too tight. You probably want to do them one at a time. And go through and put your nuts on the back to make sure that nothing happens and it doesn't come apart. And make sure you're still spinning nicely on both the top and the bottom side. And you are almost done with putting the train itself together. The last thing we're going to do is we're actually going to use these two pieces to glue over the top here to put our train on the track to connect to the analyst. So the way we're going to do that is I'm just going to put a line of glue either around the back there or on the inside of this. We're going to use the inside edge, not the outside edge near the gears this time. Make sure that's glued and make sure you're putting face up, putting the glue on the side that you want to have be facing the top. Flip that over. Stick that over the nut. They should fit perfectly tight so you can't get them out of alignment even if you want to. And then if you spin from those bottom gears you've just put on, you can see how much easier that is because they're nice and big gears that are easy to grab hold of on spin. Make sure that all's spinning and then we'll set our train piece aside and we'll assemble the bottom of your coaster. So the one thing we've got to glue together and get aligned perfectly is we're going to put that analyst on top of the bottom piece, which I'm sure you sanded. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to put a little line of glue very carefully around the analyst. I'm going to glue that down and make sure that's centered. So use your fingers to make sure that analyst gets nice and centered. Push down, make sure the glue dries completely and it doesn't slide all over the place. Getting this piece centered is the most important piece of building this particular coaster. And we're going to be all set here in a minute to do that. And then we're going to take this thick ring and put it on top there to give us a surface to spin on. So we're going to do that all the way around there and we'll set that on top of there like so. That doesn't have to be as aligned as perfectly, but it will sure look nicer if it is. Once that's aligned, and the glue is dried, you're actually ready to do the final assembly on making the train spin. So I'm going to test my pieces one more time, make sure we're still spinning. I'm going to take that long 5/8 inch screw and put it through the top. If it's too tight and you need to use a screwdriver to tighten it down, that's fine. I'm going to put it through those two spacers we put on, and then we're going to get it sitting down really nicely. Hopefully not take it apart. So that's going to get my two gears to sit into the analyst to make sure things spin. What we will probably notice is that they spin better one direction than they do the other. It'll get looser the other direction over time. But the direction, at least for me, that it's spinning easier right now is the direction I would want the wheels to spin anyway. So I think that's okay. So now I'm ready to put my nut on the back. If you're ready to finish it and you've tested it and you're sure you're happy, you can go ahead and glue this nut on the back. Again, just a little bit of glue and putting that nut on ever so carefully so that it stays nice and loose. Loose is going to be really important here. If you stay nice and loose, it'll spin really nicely. If you get too tight, then these bottom gears don't have a way to spin and they cause trouble. So keeping it nice and loose is your first secret of your success here. Once I'm good with that, I'm actually going to spin this center screw a few times just to make sure it's nice and loose. Everything looks perfect to me. I've got lots of space on the back. So I can glue my bottom on now, so I can set my coaster down. I'm going to put a ring of glue around there. Set the bottom on. Make sure that gets nice and centered as well. It's all about getting it centered. And give the glue a minute to dry. And you've got two choices. If you don't want a coaster, if you really just want this to be a cool train, and that didn't glue, you could stop right now. Put the feet on the bottom and you'd have a really fun table piece with a train on it. But I'm assuming you're going to want this to be a coaster. If you run into this problem, more glue. Sometimes the super glue just doesn't want to stick no matter how hard you push. And while I've got it turned over like this, I'm going to put the feet on the bottom. They are self-sticky, but if you don't put a little dot of glue under them, they tend to come off. So I'm going to leave my glue there, put my little dot of glue on these. And glue the feet down on the bottom of this. And flip it over, and now I've got that all assembled and ready to go. So now we're going to have to put the top layers on. So next you're going to use two of your thicker pieces. I've got two pieces here, and I'm going to glue these two thick rings around. The easiest way in my mind to do it is put the glue on from here. Get that nice and centered. Again, the prettier your coaster will be if all these layers are nice and centered and ready to go. Put a second layer of coaster on, like a thick ring on the top, like so. And now I have my second thick ring on this. And now I'm going to take this thin ring. When we're putting this on, notice that these are really delicate. Be really careful. Don't squeeze it too much. I'm just going to put a nice light layer of glue all the way around it, like so. Make sure that dries nicely. And drop that on the middle and not squeezing because we don't want to deform the circle at all, but we're going to make sure that aligns perfectly to the rest of our stack of our coaster. You may want to pause for a minute here, go get a drink, a sip of coffee or something else. Make sure that that glue dries nicely before you go to the next layer. So I'm going to give that a second to sit. And take a sip of coffee myself. Once we're ready, make sure your hands have no glue on them. Make sure if you've got super glue on your hands, it's completely dry. I'm going to peel the acrylic off one side completely. And on the other side, to make it a little safer, I'm going to start the acrylic all the way around. Make sure it's not on the center. But I'm going to go ahead and leave the center part of it stuck. Make it a little easier to put it in the hole. And build a little puff there. And then I'm going to flip this upside down and sit it down out of the way. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a very thin line of glue around the top. If you haven't watched the basics video on glue safety, you should do that. We show you what happens when super glue and acrylic gets together. And it is not a pretty sight. So we're going to go ahead and put that ring of glue on the top and then ever so carefully set my ring of acrylic into my hole and take my top ring and set it on top of that. This is where you want to make sure you don't let your top ring slide around, because if it does, you will end up getting glue on your piece of acrylic. Get that top ring pushed down a little bit to make sure that top ring sets in place and isn't sliding, and then you can get rid of that second piece of acrylic, and you've got a train coaster all ready to play with, all ready to show off or give as a gift or do anything you want to with it this holiday season. Thanks so much.